So this is the male loneliness crisis, why the media lies about it by Mentis Wave. Now I don't know how else can someone twist the current loneliness crisis into something worse than it already is, but given how 2026 has progressed so far, Trump surviving his third assassination attempt is also something that I couldn't even make it up even if I tried. So yeah, let's continue. Now for those listening to this video on the background, the Western world has quietly become a civilization that has tainted the interaction between men and women. This is unfair to both genders and is a recipe for rapid civilizational decline by Imran Khan. That's the text on the screen. Let's continue on.
Hey internets, you may have heard of something known as the male loneliness crisis. And in this video, I'm going to explain why the true cause of it is much more interesting than most people realize, and also how this true cause goes back much further in history than most people realize as well. But to start off, here's a quick rundown of just what this crisis is and how we know it is actually happening and not just an example of victim perception bias, where people just feel like something in society is specifically designed to screw them even when there really isn't. No, in this case, the male loneliness crisis is definitely a real thing. Many young men these days are walking the dark alleys of life alone in ways that the older generations and most women in general could never possibly comprehend. And
Yeah, I'll throw my 2 cents in here. I think it's because we actually don't really need each other as much as we used to. I mean, we used to need to, cooperate with one another to survive in a very dangerous world. Now more than ever, you can just walk down to the nearest store and get what you need and then just go home. Right? Even that, to some extent, is unnecessary with the rise of delivery apps such as Grab, Uber, or I don't know, DoorDash. It's difficult to convince someone to meet someone new when there's simply no need for it, especially in modern times, right? And also, if you don't drink alcohol, for example, if you go to the club areas of your city, you're gonna feel lonely there, right? Even though you're surrounded by people. Why? Because they're all doing things that you don't quite enjoy yourself, and you'll find it a struggle to connect with them.
we know this for two reasons. For one, there's a lot of data that converges to show that it's definitely happening, with the most commonly cited statistic being the fact that the percentage of young men who aren't getting any has been steadily on the rise over the last few decades, with a notable spike around 2008. But there's a lot more to it than that. For example, the percentage of men who report that they have no close friends at all has increased in the last 3 decades as well. Young men are also more likely to have no partner than women. In the United States especially, young men are more likely to report that they have feelings of loneliness in general, and of course there's the fact that the marriage rate has been steadily declining since the mid-1960s. And then of course there's the fact that women tend to be significantly more picky when it comes to online dating choices, rating the vast majority of men as unattractive. And thus the bar for a man to actually get into a relationship and get out of his loneliness hole is notably higher. It's also important to point out that when it comes to victimhood perceptions, this is a case where we know that the opposite effect would be relevant, because when it comes to self-reported data and differences between self-reported data and revealed data, most of the data is actually based on things that men tend to underreport, whereas women tend to actually overreport it, which means that the real data is actually probably worse than this. And then the second reason that we know that the male loneliness epidemic is real is because the arguments against it being real are completely ridiculous, ranging from psychological projection to anecdotal experiences, and of course let's not forget the just make more friends bro argument, or just standard cathedralite woke schlop midwit misinterpretation of the data. The only argument against it I've seen that kind of makes sense is people claiming that there's kind of a general loneliness epidemic and that women are suffering from it too, which in fact is kind of correct. Women have indeed been reporting less close friends as well. However, remember, when it comes to self-reported data, there is again a gender gap. Men tend to underreport these problems where women tend to overreport it. However, it is definitely true that women are suffering from this too. In fact, more so than I suspect a lot of people in the manosphere realize. But I'll get more into that a bit later. Much in the same way that it is not okay.
Yeah, I skipped that part. It was a advertisement plug for Mentis Wave. It's about a VPN if you want to check it out on your own.
Now, there are a lot of proposed reasons for why this male loneliness epidemic exists, but for the most part they fall into two camps: the manosphere camp and the woke feminism camp. With the manosphere proposing that the problem is rooted in that social media and online dating has effectively fried women's brains and caused them to become more picky. And thus, they say a large portion of women are all kind of competing for the attention of a small group of top 20 or even top 10% alpha males, also known as chads. Whereas the wokes largely propose that the reason for male loneliness comes down to the fault of toxic masculinity and men refusing to commit, as well as blaming the manosphere and saying that the reason men are lonely is because men are being taught to be mean to women. Or basically they claim that the reason is misogyny. And now what's interesting about these two camps is that neither of them are completely correct, but neither of them are completely 100% wrong either. However,
Yeah, you kind of forget that the algorithms are incentivized to show contents that keep you on the website for as long as possible. I mean, they'll show the most ridiculous and out there videos into your feed. I mean, just take a look at my YouTube uploads and then you see what gets recommended to me on a regular basis. And let's just say that they'll show the most ridiculous and out there videos into your feed and try to get a reaction out of you so that you stay on the platform and engage with their content. And the kind of videos, the kind that are long form like this, created by Mentis Wave, rarely show up on my feed for obvious reasons because A, it's less screaming and less entertaining, and B, there's also less drama and less dumb shit. This is actually a well thought out video in my opinion. Again, I'm also kind of incentivized to also react to videos of people doing dumb shit. So I may be a part of the problem because I get to decide what I cover on this channel. So yeah, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I guess.
manosphere is a bit closer to being correct, and you'll find that out as I go through things. Because of course, one of the basic problems with the wokes blaming the male loneliness crisis on the manosphere is that the male loneliness crisis significantly predates the manosphere. And so that's obviously not a thing. Or as one of my mods on Discord pointed out, they're basically accusing Andrew Tate of having a time machine, which very obviously is not a thing. So anyway, to find the real reasons for this crisis, let's start from the beginning. When did relationships between men and women start to kind of show a downward shift? When did things start to go south? And there's a few things we can look at in history that kind of shows when it all started. One of them is to look at the birth rates, which have been steadily falling in most of the developed world since the 1960s, but also in the least developed countries starting around the 1980s. And this is one of those things that's actually a bit complicated. Birth rates can fall for a lot of reasons. It's rarely just one silver bullet, mainly because it's an issue of human action and incentives. This is because at low time preference or delaying gratification generally associated with higher IQ individuals, having children is often a complex long-term cost-benefit analysis. For the most part, people want to have kids, most people anyway, but kids are expensive, and so couples planning a child have to account for that. Whereas at high time preference or just the immediate gratification, it's mostly just the incentive of LMAO, Smex feels good. And so it really just kind of comes down to how horny two people feel in the moment. And so birth rates can therefore be affected by issues that affect either of these mentalities. At low time preference, this could mean legal barriers and regulations or issues that make long-term relationships less viable. Whereas at high time preference, it comes down to simpler things like access to birth control or legalization of abortion, things more of that nature. But the main thing showing that the problem is related to the birth rates is how it correlates to the issue of marriage. As I mentioned earlier, marriage rates have been falling, but what really stands out is when you look at it by generation. The millennials have been getting married less than Generation X, and Generation Z has been getting married significantly less so. I mean, just look at this right here. People born
Yeah, to quote a famous divorce lawyer, James Sexton, what is the problem to which marriage is a solution? Right? Do we still have the same problems as we did in the 1940s, 1950s? Probably not.
born in the 1990s, by age 25, are nearly 3 times less likely to be married than those who were born in the 1940s were at age 25. And that right there is huge. Something happened. And because millennials are only slightly better off, We know that the thing that happened very much predates the existence of Andrew Tate as a popular figure. In fact, it very much predates the entire manosphere, because what we see as the manosphere is something that largely rose around the 2010s. And while it was based on a few earlier communities that existed in the early 2000s and even some in the late 90s, those communities were very small. And yet we can see that something was already happening quite a while ago. And so we have to ask ourselves what exactly happened between the 60s and 70s. And the answer is that around this time, globally in first world countries, but especially in the United States, we started to see a whole lot more what you can call entitlement laws that ultimately have the negative impact of disincentivizing marriage, and in many cases actively rewarding what would ordinarily be seen as a poor choice. The worst of the bunch probably being the horrifying interaction of no-fault divorce laws plus alimony. Ordinarily allowing couples to get divorced for no specific reason is really just free association. The problem happens when you have the state step in and forcibly mandate extraction of wealth from one party to another, even without knowing what's at fault. Now, no-fault divorce came into being around the end of the 1960s and was implemented throughout the 1970s, with alimony being
Yeah, no fault divorce, to quote James Sexton again, was supposed to solve another problem facing the family courts at that time. Now, before the implementation of no fault divorce, before anyone can get divorced, they first need to meet the legal threshold for a legally acceptable reason to get divorced. This means that lawyers often get into fights about whether they can get divorced in the first place, right? And this obviously created a backlog and actually bogged down the entire family court system. So they thought, okay, we are we are just fighting over whether we can get divorced. Let's just end this already. Otherwise, we're just gonna have to burn this whole marriage to ashes. However, given that many other laws have not changed, even if those laws changed, many came much later after the implementation of the no fault divorce. That's why we have a situation where the marriage ended on no fault grounds, but then things like alimony, child support payments are actually still enforced, right? Let's just say the other laws haven't been adjusted yet to, you know, take into account the existence of no fault divorce, which again, same question to be asked again, what is the problem to which marriage is a solution?
being much older. And if you don't know what that means, alimony is the payments that you have to make to a spouse when you've divorced them. Generally, when a couple gets divorced, the one earning less money can file to have a portion of their ex's income forcibly extracted from them by the state and then given to them. And that creates a very not good interaction, because from a cultural perspective and also just from the perspective of how human psychology works, men are generally expected to be the breadwinners. And so what happens is this actually creates a kind of perverted incentive for women to betray their husbands. If a woman decides that she just wants to cheat on her husband, or any other bad decision that would ultimately result in ruining her marriage, the way the laws work now, that woman is actually rewarded for that behavior rather than punished. Another problem that happened around the same time as the mid-60s is welfare in the US faced a pretty dramatic shift. Mainly the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, which is basically just giving cash to low-income families, was expanded and had a law on top of it called the Man in the House Law, which made families ineligible for this type of welfare if there was some kind of man in the house who was providing assistance, the consequences of which just greatly incentivized divorce, because this made it so that poor families would actually get paid more money by the state by breaking up and no longer being together. Now, fortunately, the specific man in the house part of the law was quickly identified to be very stupid, and so it was abolished quite quickly. However, the problem is these things haven't really been completely abolished. They persist today, just in different forms. AFDC was eventually replaced in the 1990s with TANF, with certain states effectively enacting the exact same policies. And while the man in the house rule is gone, the fact is there's still broader penalties in terms of welfare when it comes to married families. Because if a second earner joins the house,
Which, I mean, listening to this guy, you seem to get penalized if you get married in the US, right? And which, I mean, no one sits you down and explains what happens when you sign that piece of paper, right? Now, I'm not talking about marriage under God that you go to church and then you make a vow in front of the priest. In some religious circles, I'm talking about the legal institution of marriage, the one you sign with the state, right? The one you go in front of the church and then make a vow is a completely different thing to the one when you go to, say, in my case, City Hall, when you sign the registration of marriage, for example. Those two things are completely different, right?
then that will ultimately reduce their eligibility. This is one of the many things that contributes to what's known as the welfare trap, which is that sometimes earning more money can actually result in less available money to a family that is dependent on welfare. Because if you're, say, getting welfare that is equal to about $10,000 in worth, and you earn $40,000, and you will lose that eligibility if you earn, say, $45,000 in your current predicament, then that increase in pay actually results in less money, which incentivizes people to actually not aim for better careers just to stay on welfare, or in this particular instance, encouraged to not get married just so that they can stay on welfare. But anyways, in both of these cases regarding alimony and direct welfare payments, both of them effectively are just the state giving women incentive to divorce their husbands, even when the reason isn't a very good one. Both these problems are made worse by family court law, which coincidentally also saw reforms during around the 1970s. In concordance with no-fault divorce, family court stopped being about who did what, and instead became something that just kind of de facto awarded women custody. Naysayers to this problem will point to the fact that when fathers do actually try in family courts, they are likely to at least win joint custody. The problem with that logic, though, is that generally legal counsel will only suggest that you actually pursue a legal avenue if you have a chance of winning. And so usually the ladies only lose in family courts if there's something significantly wrong with her, such as her being a crack addict or something like that. And then, of course, let's not forget the Civil Rights Act and DEI entitlements. I've made an entire video on why the Civil Rights Act isn't actually a good thing, but the TLDR of it for anybody who isn't aware of why it's not actually good and why it doesn't actually do what it claims to do, is that this act from the 1960s would be better described as a Civil Entitlements Act. Because it doesn't actually enforce things based on equality, but what it actually does is it enforces things based on equity, which combined with the wage gap lie, creates the justification for affirmative action and DEI policies, largely going towards benefiting women. And really all of these laws that I've just mentioned all kind of have the same effect to some degree. It is the state forcibly extracting money from men and then giving it to women, and being especially punishing to married men if their wives decide to betray them for pretty much any reason. You might be wondering how exactly is that relevant to male loneliness? Well, now is where the rabbit hole really starts to get deep, because the ultimate result of all of this is that men just end up being disincentivized from marrying in the first place. You see, the problem here is that historically, women have always been the gatekeepers of relationships and intimacy, while men have historically been the gatekeepers of monetary resources and commitment. And when you try to use the force of the state to force one to give up what they have to another, because basically gender socialism is what's going on here, what actually happens in practice is you just incentivize the person who's being stolen from to refuse to play the game. Which is actually one of the basic same reasons that socialism in general doesn't work. The net producers will just refuse to produce. And much in the same way in this case, what actually happens is that the most efficient tactic for men, under a system that effectively screws them over for giving commitment, is that they just become less likely to give commitment. And when you combine this with cultural revolutions such as the free love movement of the hippies, which, also happened around the 1960s, funny enough, a lot of coincidences here, the winning move of the game for men, especially for men who are in the top 20% of men in terms of attractiveness, or high-value men as defined by women, the winning move for them becomes to not play. Put yourselves in the shoes of a man under this system, but not just any man, a wealthy, successful, attractive, tall, 6 foot, 6-pack, 6 figures at least man. If you know that the state is just going to forcibly extract your wealth in the event that your future wife decides to betray you, but you also live in a culture of free love, then what do? That's right, you just never get married. And that's exactly what a lot of men started doing at the time.
This is why I'm, in a way, a libertarian. This is why I'm suspicious of government plans. Look at the mess they've created. Sure, when governments stop criminals from robbing people or killing people, that's the job they were created to do. They have done something beneficial if they, stick to those jobs. But when they are put in charge of any other things like ensuring welfare for their citizens, let's just say they suck at their job pretty badly in this case.
They just stopped being interested in marriage and instead adopted a more pragmatic but also significantly more degenerate approach of simply entering into casual relationships with women that were doomed to fail. Or as I said earlier on Zitter, these men now, instead of committing, just shuffle through girls, pumping and dumping them before moving on to the next. And so the result of this system is a sort of neo-polygamy dating market where women are all quote-unquote married to the state while getting leased out to be used as unwitting whores by chads. This is why the Andrew Tate strategy of self-maxing and then treating women like toys to be used and discarded is so popular. It's degenerate, it's mean, it's morally wrong, but in the system that the state has designed, in terms of where the incentives lead these men to go, it's what works. It's what wins in this rigged game. Because you can't get taken to divorce court and screwed for alimony if you instead just decide to live life in the fast lane and never get married. Very simple as. And here's the thing, the incentives for men to do that were already in place by roughly 1975. And so in the early 80s, you already saw a lot of men living this lifestyle. This was already the meta. It was already the valid play. The only problem with it is that it's not the good play for society as a whole. For social stability, monogamy is what you want. There is a very good reason why there has never really been any kind of grand civilization that didn't put some kind of value on monogamy. There's overwhelming evidence that shows that it is the best system when it comes to raising children, ensuring that they grow up educated and relatively safe, and with low time preference morality. And it's really quite simple from a rationalist perspective. Any civilization that does not pass the baton is ultimately doomed to eventually fail. And yet that's exactly the direction where many laws and as well as cultural issues have gone since the post-World War II era. And the thing is, when you look at other first world countries, you'll see that similar, not quite the same, but similar laws have been propping up around the same time. And this is an issue because what's effectively happening is you're just wreaking havoc on the traditional family structure, which is honestly kind of a subject for another video. But more importantly here, back to the dating market and relationships and the loneliness crisis. How does this all add up? Well, the issue here is that if you have the top men in terms of attractiveness no longer really interested in commitment, and instead just constantly going through different girls until they get bored of them, you're going to see a system that looks sort of like this. Let's take a look at this simple chart of men and women ranked from 1 to 10, 10 being the most attractive and 1 being the least attractive in terms of average attractiveness. If you've watched any Manosphere videos, you've probably seen this before, especially if you've seen channels like HoMath. I'm going to simplify it a little bit, specifically in just the main things that have happened as a result of these laws and cultural issues, as well as why it happened. When you have these men being disincentivized from committing, then naturally a portion of them are just going to play these girls instead of ever giving commitment, because of course the legal system punishes them for committing, so why would they commit? And the girls, they just can't figure it out. Why is it all of these men are not interested in commitment? Why are all of these men so lame? Where have all the good men gone? Why are...
Well, they play with fire, and now they're surprised that they got burnt. Like, they f***ed around and they found out. Did anybody tell them that that's a terrible idea? Ever? Or did they ever listen?
Aren't these men putting in any real effort? It's truly a mystery. And now some of the ladies will wise up. They'll go for the 6 out of 7 out of 10 men. And the problem is the slightly above average men, they're suffering from the same incentives. They may have a harder time in the dating market as the guys above them, but in this slightly above average area, men are still attractive enough that they can have options. And again, because the laws disincentivize commitment, all men, regardless of where they fall on this graph, are gonna be slightly less interested in commitment, but especially the men at the top, because of course they don't have to give commitment at all, ever. Meanwhile, all of the men down here and the 1 to 5 out of 10 men, well, they're struggling to get anything. And the thing is, this is creating a system that is not fun for anybody. This is unfair to both sexes. If you're a man in this game, you suffer from one of two problems. Either A, you're one of the men who could give commitment and could put in effort, but you're tempted to not do so because the current status system punishes you for doing so, which basically causes us to be significantly more paranoid than we otherwise would be, and thus will only give commitment if we find a genuinely good woman out there. Or you're a man in the bottom half and you're basically not getting any. This is basically where the male loneliness crisis comes in. And while part of it is just because women are significantly more picky, which to be honest is kind of fair, because women do sacrifice more on a biological level in a sense when it comes to rearing children. That's kind of obvious. But another thing that makes it hard is also just the fact that because these men aren't giving commitment, women, that means that those men stay in the dating pool and just kind of take up all the rest of the women. If a man at the top is spinning multiple plates, as it's sometimes called, playing multiple girls at the same time, well, since the population is roughly 50% men and 50% women, then statistics will have it that a lot of men are just getting nothing at all, which is exactly what's happening. And it's important to point out here that this is not just about sex. It's about getting anything at all. Men at the bottom, the average to below average attractiveness male, the lower value man, it's not just getting some that is the problem. It's getting any kind of attention at all. They often get no love, no intimacy, nothing at all. Sometimes for years, for decades, for some of them never in their life. It's an issue of not even being acknowledged as a human being who wants love just as much as anybody else. And so they often walk through life, often walking through the hardest times of their life, with absolutely nobody giving the slightest crap about them. And this is something a lot of women have a hard time really visualizing just how bad it can get. Because women, even a below average woman, can go on online dating and at least get something in her DMs on a pretty regular day-to-day basis. You have to understand, men at the bottom get nothing. Absolutely nothing. But
This is why, gentlemen, do what works for you. Okay? They won't have your back when shit hits the fan. Right? They're not there when you needed help. So when you climb up the ladder yourself, follow your own rules, pick wisely. Make sure that that woman fits your standards before you even commit to her, whether long term or short term. Right? Also, if a young man becomes successful without any woman by his side, chances are he's not gonna take any woman seriously. Right? Why? No one was there when he was building himself, so if you want to chase a quote unquote high value man, you're playing with fire and it can end quite badly if you're not careful. Right?
that doesn't mean that women are having it easy either. Definitely not. That's where I think some people in the manosphere get things wrong. This is not fun for women. For one, on a psychological level, women don't actually enjoy being used and discarded by the men that they find attractive. That's not an enjoyable relationship experience for women. And so women in this system, they're kind of left out in the cold, wondering why is it so many of the men that they're getting with are completely interested in putting in any effort or giving them commitment. And so from the women's perspective, the thing that women are suffering from is that they end up being tossed around in low-value relationships, finding it unreasonably difficult for them to find their, as they sometimes call, Mr. Man. Plenty of the men that they are attracted to are willing to give them attention, but very few of them, often none of them, are willing to be their Prince Charming. And so just how in economic socialism, where the state tries to force wealth from the rich to the proletariat or the poor, but ultimately this just disincentivizes production, thus harming the poor as well. In gender socialism, where the state tries to force men to give resources to women, a lot of men decide to just check out, and thus women end up also getting harmed as well, in the same way that normal socialism harms the poor. That's one of the many problems of socialism in any form, including this form. It's not sustainable, and it has unintended consequences. And because most people meet their partners in online dating these days, we have plenty of data that proves that this is definitely happening. I mean, just compare the swipe rates between men to women and women to men, and just wow, it just kind of speaks for itself. But then you look at the fact that the marriage rate is still in the toilet, and you realize that women aren't really getting what they want either. And this all brings us to the next kind of obvious question. If things are messed up, and the direction that first world countries have been taking has clearly not been working, why is it nobody has been able to figure out a fix for the problem? And the reason for that is that both sides are kind of wrong about what's really causing it. The manosphere is less wrong. For instance, they occasionally recognize the element of the state in this farce. For instance, Homath recognizes that there is definitely an issue with the state forcibly extracting money from men and then giving it to women, and thus women just kind of keep raising their standards because they don't want to date down. But one issue I see in the manosphere is that they kind of overblame the apps. The apps are definitely, from a cultural perspective, increasing the problem. However, you have to remember that the problem started as early as 1975. This was already the meta based on the current laws, as they have been for a very long time now, for decades. And so what the apps really did is they just made it easier to follow the meta. They just made it so that men at the top can more easily find plates to spin, and women can more easily fall for those men. Or in other words, dating apps basically just pushed our culture to the logical conclusions. We were already heading towards a hedonistic destination, and the apps just allowed us to get to that destination faster. And so
that's one way to look at it. The dating apps just added fuel to the fire and made it burn hotter. to the point that people can no longer ignore the problem in a good way.
Banning the apps without also taking a look at the status laws that got us here, that's not really going to fix the problem. That's just going to put the problem back on slow mode. We'll still be going towards the same bad destination. We'll just be going back towards riding towards that destination on a bicycle instead of a motorcycle. Whereas on the other side of the equation, how the wokes are wrong about this, that's where things get really bad. Another problem that happened around the 60s and 70s is that intelligentsia also started to become infested with an unbelievable amount of neo-Marxist idiocy. And that's a very big problem, because the thing is, the manosphere being slightly wrong about what's causing this loneliness crisis, insofar as that they overblame the apps, well, it's completely inconsequential because they don't really have meaningful influence. I mean, sure, on the internet they do, but in terms of our institutions, they really aren't in control of anything. In terms of mainstream journalism and mainstream media and academia, as well as much as the state and politicians, well, the manosphere has absolutely nothing in that regard compared to the woke scold camps, who have fully embedded themselves into those institutions. And so in addition to the wokes being significantly more wrong, it also has much more widespread consequences, because their incorrect beliefs are what's being taught to the public en masse. Their view is the one that's considered politically correct. And what's interesting is that just like this crisis goes back further in history than most people realize, wokeness and it being wrong about it also goes back to around the same time. One of the big problems, at least in academia around the 60s and 70s, is that they started mass adapting the idea of tabula rasa or blank slateism under the misguided belief that anything to the contrary could have a bigoted outcome. And this created a very weird incentive within academia for researchers to publish kind of nonsensical data with nonsensical reasoning behind it, so long as it resulted in the conclusion that people were biologically equal. It's pretty obvious by today that this kind of thinking actually makes bigotry and sexism and racism, etc., actually significantly worse. But back then it wasn't immediately obvious from an empirical sense. It was already obvious by a rational sense, but the empirical angle wasn't really quite there yet, and so people started pushing out really bad research that kind of just got a stamp of approval on it simply because it conformed to the politically correct narrative. The extent of which is an entire different rabbit hole, which I've actually covered in many of my other videos already on this channel. But for the sake of this video's topic, the male loneliness crisis and gender relations, the main problem was the tabula rasa research in regards to gender, which is by far the absolute stupidest version of tabula rasa. Because
Yeah, tabula rasa seems to be the epitome of around and find out, and then ignore the results. At this point, what's worse, right? At least in scientific facts, it is written down so that people don't, I mean, in chemistry, for example, it is written down so that people don't mix two dangerous chemicals together and then get blown to pieces. With tabula rasa, people just ignore the results and then they just go jump off a cliff together. It seems to be that's what's happening right now.
when it comes to different ethnic groups, you can at least try. There are at least some arguments you can make for why behavioral and cognitive differences are mostly environmental. Arguments that completely fall apart when you're talking about differences between the sexes. And so the cult of tabula rasa has a really horrible track record when it comes to gender science. An almost comically bad track record, actually. Examples of this nonsense includes trying to claim that men and women are actually equal in regards to physical strength because of quote-unquote relative strength, whatever the heck that means, and other meaningless arbitrary variables while ignoring overall strength, which of course after a narrative review were found to be pedantically correct on the things they measured, but overall completely irrelevant. Then there's John's money theory that all gender roles and identity are learned and that we are all just blank slates, man, up to the age of 2, which despite this theory being heavily refuted, still finds itself being thrown around by wokes today. And then of course there's the claim that men and women have no innate psychological differences, alongside now refuted research claiming no difference in spatial or mathematical reasoning. And then there's that especially damaging ones that claim that physical female beauty standards are entirely the result of culture and that men would therefore find Gigantosauruses attractive if the evil patriarchy would just stop brainwashing us by showing us fit women in the media. This one earned special recognition because it's part of where the justification in modern feminism for the all women are 10s mentality comes from, despite the studies behind it also having been very heavily debunked. And then of course there's a bonus point for kind of fringe weirdos back in the day pushing a very weird conspiracy theory that the reason women were on average smaller than men was because of the patriarchy somehow ensuring that girls were being fed less calories, which was probably honestly just a misunderstanding of studies on food allocation in South Asian cultures. And the saddest part is that everything I just mentioned is just just a small drop in the bucket of the absolutely insane amount of research pushing tabula rasa in ways that reveal themselves to not really make much sense when analyzed. TLDR, gender studies is filled with nonsense, and I predict that in the next 20 years or so, much of the establishment narrative on it will be dissolved and revealed to be completely fraudulent. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, science is around and find out, note down the results, and then analyze it later. Tabula rasa seems to be around and find out, ignore the results, don't even talk about it. No wonder they keep getting themselves into big trouble. Right?
Anyway, how this pertains to our loneliness crisis is quite simple. How can the establishment hope to correctly understand and fix this crisis if they are busy sticking their heads in the sand and dragging their feet when it comes to acknowledging the most basic differences between men and women? And the answer is they don't. They just end up pushing total nonsense. And it really shows. If you read mainstream corporate media on dating advice, most of what they have to say is completely ridiculous. For instance, a dating advice magazine for girls on the shelf will usually tell them things like, you deserve a high-value man because you just do, and that they should sleep around, get knocked up because being a single mother is empowering. For some reason. The media fills women's heads with absurdly wrong things on a constant day-to-day basis. One recent example, very recent example that actually caused me to delay this video slightly, is this video from Salon, where they claim that they totally understand the reason for the male loneliness crisis. And so I'm going to quickly go over it because it beautifully emphasizes how mainstream press and really our institutions in general truly have no idea what they are talking about when it comes to how men ended up in this sorry state and how the dating scene got so screwed up and why so many things regarding family and marriage seem to be going downhill. And of course how they have even less of an idea how to fix it. I will not clip it because Salon could potentially abuse Content ID. Instead, here's a quick rundown of their brilliant ideas, and a link will be in the description below so you can see the video for yourself if you want to check if I'm misrepresenting them, which sadly I am not. Anyway, the video starts out immediately accusing the manosphere of mainly wanting women to lower their standards, and that's somehow the entire thing behind the male loneliness crisis. Which, aside from that just being a bad faith straw man of the issue and what the general manosphere and red pill community is saying, it also shows they don't really understand what's going on. Because the issue isn't so much just something that can be easily fixed by women lowering their standards. The problem is a lot more complicated. And it kind of comes down to the basics of how dating works. The dating market is essentially just a numbers game. There are Y number of people on the planet, and X number of those people will find you attractive. And so you kind of have to filter for X. Basically, you find a partner for which the attraction is mutual. Pretty basic on that level, to be honest. But it is slightly different for men and women because, again, men are the gatekeepers of commitment and women are the gatekeepers of intimacy. And so men kind of have to move quickly to ensure that they're not getting friend-zoned, and women have to make sure that the men that they're investing their time into are men that will actually be interested in them enough to commit to them. If you're a woman and you don't want to get played, the answer to your problems is to stop chasing the most attractive man you can find, and instead look for the men that are actually interested in being loyal to you, and then find a man from that pool of men that you find attractive as well, and go for that man instead.
You see what I mean? They f***ed around and found out. Then they ignore the results and try to hide it. Or worse, silence it if someone tries to, point it out. It seems like you really just can't save stupid at this point.
The issue that a lot of the broader manosphere points out, and really any of us who understand the dating market, is that modern institutions don't really explain this to women at all. Women are just kind of told that, oh, you just deserve the man that you want, and he'll just love you for who you are no matter what, and if he doesn't, then he's a misogynist loser or something. And within mainstream journalism, because they're very heavily in favor of the woke scold idea, there's also a very big problem with hypocrisy. Because female beauty standards are significantly more highly likely to be portrayed as politically incorrect, whereas on the flip side, they have no problem with saying that there is such thing as a high-value man. Hence why this video from Salon is so quick to say, oh, it can't be women's fault, it must be the men's fault. They do it simply because it's more politically correct to say, even though it's obviously self-contradictory and wrong to anybody who thinks about it for more than a few seconds.
Sometimes I wonder, how much are they getting paid to come up with nonsense like this? Is it really worth the money? Or are they just that stupid to not realize that they're getting played by everyone? Or that no one's gonna take them seriously if they fall for garbage like this? I don't know what's going on here. Are they just getting paid? Is the money really that worth it?
which is completely bizarre because it treats men as if we have no agency. But of course we do. Men are not going to give commitment to a woman who we don't think is worth it. So it's not so much that women need to lower their standards, it's that women are being taught to kind of have the wrong idea of how their standards should even work in the first place. They're being taught that they don't need to filter for anything, that the man that they want should just be the man that they deserve, and that all women are 10s. And any man who suggests that a woman might be better off if she takes any kind of responsibility for herself, then that man must be an incel or something.
Yeah, if age is just a number, then age is really just a number for this idiot. Right? Instead of taking their points, they instead decide to, sling high school insults like this at them. And that's why no one takes them seriously. Their age keeps increasing, but apparently they didn't get any wiser. They have gotten dumber, if I would say so myself. Just, I don't know. You really can't say stupid, I guess.
Like that. It is a completely ridiculous double standard. And when you frame that as saying, oh, women should just lower their standards, that's an oversimplification of the problem. It's intentionally not understanding it. And I think they do this because they don't want to really acknowledge how the incentives against marriage have crept up over the last 60 years. And so as a form of sticking their heads in the sand, they just ignore the problem outright. Then the next thing the Salon video does is they of course just blame the male loneliness crisis on men and the general manosphere, further showing that they have no concept of how far back this has been happening. As I explained earlier in this video, the reasons for this crisis go back far in history, over 60 years, and are rooted in laws that ultimately incentivize the destruction of the family structure, which of course significantly predates the manosphere. So obviously the manosphere cannot be at fault. And so this is just a case of them confusing cause and effect. The manosphere is more or less a response to the male loneliness crisis. It's comprised of influencers who are talking to young men and explaining to them how to fix their situation, and largely from a standpoint of empathy, something that men are just kind of not getting from the mainstream institutions, which is again part of the real reason that the crisis exists. It portrays it as a right-wing, left-wing thing, which is actually just empirically incorrect. Right-wing men actually tend to be more successful in relationships and are actually more likely to be married. And also, the incel community is more or less split down the middle. They're more in the center. They're equally Democrat and equally Republican or whatever. And so while there is a growing left and right political divide between men and women, that's not actually the cause of the male loneliness crisis. It's again just another one of the symptoms. And of course, trying to imply that conservative or right-wing men in any way are lay incels is just objectively not true. The video also proceeds to just kind of cherry-pick bad examples from the manosphere, tries to claim that being a trad wife somehow means when women have no rights, which is totally false. Women can absolutely choose a traditional lifestyle while having the same rights as men. But perhaps the weirdest thing that the Salon video does is it talks about Alyssa Wu and then conflates the manosphere with the Gooner sphere, which makes absolutely no sense, because if you're familiar with the manosphere, you know that they generally push traditional gender roles, and they're actually very much against porn. A lot of them believe that porn should be outright banned or taxed, or the more libertarian sectors of the manosphere simply believe that porn should be more looked down upon and properly recognized as a high time preference addiction. And what makes
Yeah, I actually believe the libertarian point of view in this case. Because, I assume that the government generally wants to help people of their own country. I know that sounds absolutely unbelievable given the state of modern politics. But, every political philosophy requires assumptions. So I'll start with the assumption that the government generally wants to help its own people. And my take is that the government often misidentifies the issues, and therefore they apply the wrong solution to the problem. They apply the wrong solution to the wrong problem. Or that they apply a solution and then forget about the long-term possible side effects of the solution applied. The second order effects of, applying that solution to the problem. And given that the government moves slowly, by the time they fix or implement the mitigation measure to overcome the problems caused by the implementation of the original solution, it's no longer a small fire. At that point, it's a big fireball at that moment. And it's already a bit too late by that point.
this so bizarre is that Salon understands this because they talk about it. They talk about a guy running for political office in the manosphere who wants to add a sin tax to OnlyFans, and yet they conflate those two communities with being exactly the same anyway, just because they can occasionally find some overlap if you dig hard enough in Discord, to find some fringe community or something. And ultimately what they're doing is they're just trying to portray the manosphere as lay creepy. It's entirely an argument based on lack of character to make up for them having a lack of any facts. Because that is, of course, the biggest problem with what Salon has to say. The cherry on top of it all, which is what they don't have to say. At no point in the video did they provide any kind of serious analysis of the dating market or how it works. It doesn't address the statistical problems that show up in dating apps at all, and of course it provides no explanation for how it happened, other than a loose implication that it is somehow all to men's fault. But they don't actually break any numbers down or show you what the problem is in any kind of meaningful detail. And there's really just two reasons they do this. The first and most obvious one is that they just don't really obviously know anything. Mainstream media again has no idea what's going on, and therefore no idea how to fix it. But
I would disagree on that point. Mainstream media today are incentivized to sensationalize every story to make it entertaining for the masses to watch. Now you know now you know why politics today is such a clown show today, right? And I don't know, maybe it's the chicken and the egg problem. Was politics always a clown show, or did the media make politics a clown show? Feel free to find it in the comments below.
the other reason, I suspect, is because some of them may be kind of aware that they're partially at fault for the problem. Because one of the contributors to this loneliness crisis is, of course, the media gaslighting people for over 60 years now with tabula rasa and politically correct woke nonsense that isn't true, and ultimately just justifies the problem's continuation. And the thing is, when someone or an organization is at fault for a problem, one thing they can do to try and avoid responsibility is to project that fault somewhere else. And that's really what Salon's video actually is. It is just a massive amount of psychological projection. It is effectively just stereotypical corpo media journo slop, where a clueless leftist progressive blames all young men for a problem, despite the fact that the problem predates when young men were born by multiple decades.
Yeah, there's a saying, right? You might lose an argument with the wise man, but you can't win an argument with a fool. When talking to fools, you might want to put progressive left in that category. There's no winning. They'll shift the goalposts, they'll throw up red herrings, and worst of all, you'll know less about the world than when you went into the debate. At least when you're debating a wise man, you learn something. Or at least that's a better use of your precious time. Everyone has 24 hours in a day. Don't waste it. Use it wisely, alright?
And so to make up for Salon's failure, I'm going to conclude this video with just that. How do we actually fix this crisis? How do we fix this problem? What can be done about all the loneliness in modern clown world? Which actually isn't really an easy question because it's caused by multiple layers of legal, status, technological, and cultural reasons. But it also can't solely be blamed on the fault of women either, as no individual is actually in control of the institutions that are driving the problem. It is the fault of the system and the ludicrous propaganda it uses to maintain itself. So to actually fix it would require a multi-step process. First is on the state end of things. We need to get rid of the incentives that are preventing men from wanting to marry, and thus incentivizing men to kind of just use and discard women, because that's actually one thing that also makes the problem worse, which has actually been identified by the manosphere. A lot of the manosphere actually does recognize that there is a problem that is often called ruining virgins for everybody else. They kind of know that playing women isn't good, but the current system kind of incentivizes it as well. So let's start there. Abolish alimony for no-fault divorce, and make it so the spouse who initiates divorce can't collect alimony either. Alimony is honestly a very outdated concept anyways.
Or before you even get married, ask what is the problem to which marriage is a solution to, right? And if you do decide to get married, should the government get involved? Have you seen, if the past 40 minutes is not an indication of how the government will screw up your marriage yet, I don't know what will, right? And if for some reason you decide that the benefits of the government giving you is very good, I don't know what exactly are you getting at if you plan to bring the government in. Get a prenup, read up on what happens when you sign that piece of paper, right? What's actually shocking to me is that people know more about the rules when they drive a car than when they sign the rules that governs their marriage, their rights and obligation, right? And that's shocking to me, right?
Another thing is reforming welfare and getting rid of the welfare trap by either abolishing it or, at the very least, reform it into a negative tax income bracket. That way people would still be getting assistance, but there would no longer be a welfare cliff in anywhere, and thus the perverted incentive for families to break up would be gone as well. Although preferably it'd be better to just privatize welfare. And on that note, we also have to address issues of married families. There's actually a lot of really weird tax laws out there that specifically make things harder for married couples. The libertarian in me would like to just remove the taxes altogether, but to be more reasonable, one thing we can do to just at least incentivize marriage and incentivize commitment again is to just double the standard tax deduction for married couples, on top of the deduction for having children. Because as it currently stands in taxes, a married couple can combine their standard deduction, that's kind of how it works, but they don't really get much else out of that. Another thing is to just abolish the payroll tax. Married couples are increasingly finding themselves in a situation where one of them is in the gig economy, and the way the payroll tax works is it just unnecessarily increases their taxes for that, and so the best thing would be to just get rid of it. It's one of the worst taxes we have anyways. It's just a lame way for the government to sneakily increase people's income taxes without people noticing it. And then another thing is to abolish all DEI programs and abolish the disparate impact standard. The best person for a job should get the job, and if that means the man gets the job, then we should view that as a good thing. And of course, reduce government spending, so that way the same nonsense doesn't just show up as inflation. Which brings me to the institutional side of things. I'm personally a big fan of just firing every single state bureaucrat at this point. That may sound like scorched earth, but they have abused their positions, and they have been pushing absolute nonsense into our society, and so they have to go. And then on the private institutions, things like private academia and whatnot, that's a bit more complicated, but mainly it will just require more people being willing to put in actual good, high-quality reputations of the cult of tabula rasa, and how much of their research is just ideologically motivated nonsense. And then finally, fixing things on the personal end. Because of course there's only so much that an individual can do about the state and our institutions. So if you're a woman and you're single and you're having trouble finding a man who will actually put in effort, the biggest piece of advice for you is to just realize that you have been lied to. Learn to filter men for the men that seem interested in putting in effort towards commitment, and stop blaming the manosphere and patriarchy and misogyny on the fact that men are not always giving you what you want, because that is not the cause of the problem. Also, self-improvement is good actually. One weird way that women have it worse than men is because it is considered politically incorrect to tell women that they aren't perfect. So a lot of mainstream dating advice offers no self-max advice for women, while the manosphere provides plenty of self-max advice for men. Ironically, this actually means that girls will get better dating advice from the manosphere than they will get from corporate media.
Yeah, so now we know who not to wife up.
For this, I would again recommend Home Math. He does a pretty good job of occasionally breaking things down for the ladies as well. But then lastly, for the men who are currently in this pit of loneliness, the best advice I can give is focus on the self-maxing you can do rather than the thing that you feel least confident in. Like for example, if you're a man and you're 5'6" and you find yourself getting rejected by women simply because you're not as tall as they would like you to be, the thing is, you can't really fix that. But what you can do is fix your mentality towards it. You can learn to kind of just stop giving a shit. And so that way you'll be less self-conscious about it. That way you can focus on self-maxing the things that you actually can self-max, which will make you more confident in social situations. And of course, for both genders, just make sure you're understanding the numbers game. If you're a man, you need to move on to the next girl if she just isn't into you, or else you'll get one-itis. And if you're a woman, you need to stop aiming for the moon and instead focus on the men who are actually interested in committing to you. Get your man from that pool of men. Never try to fix a man who won't commit. You will not fix a man who won't commit. I mean, trust me on this. I knew from before I even asked my wife to start dating me that she was the type of woman that I was willing to give commitment to if things worked out, which luckily for us, things worked out. Whereas if you're in some kind of situationship with a man and he's constantly flaking on you, constantly blowing you off, and he's spending time with other girls, then spoiler alert, you're not going to get what you want. But
Yeah, if you do that, just don't go on TikTok and tell the world what a giant idiot you are. Alright? Most of us here will just sit back and laugh our ass off.
Ultimately, TLDR, what everybody needs to do is we need to recognize that the structure of the system is what's at fault. We need to, at the very least, recognize that the current system actively incentivizes men and women to screw each other over. It incentivizes men who are 8s and 9s and 10s to go on dating apps and basically find girls to play instead of getting married because the incentives for men are now against marriage. Because, of course, on the female side of things, the system incentivizes women to betray their man because the system doesn't actually require them to take responsibility for themselves anymore. Because ultimately, gender socialism is not sustainable. It will end eventually one way or another. The question is, will we be smart enough to replace it with a better system before it collapses? Because as long as the male loneliness crisis continues, we are inching closer and closer to that collapse every day. And that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching.
Now that's an interesting video. Mentis Wave really went in and broke things down for everyone to see. Now, if you're somehow still here, here's a salute for you for sticking to the end. And on that note, I hope this has been a good use of about an hour of your time, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.